Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Mary Trump to discuss her new book, The Reckoning: Our Nation's Trauma and Finding a Way to Heal, published by our friends at St. Martin's Press. Mary L. Trump is the author of the international #1 bestseller, Too Much and Never Enough: How My Family Created the World's Most Dangerous Man. She holds a Ph.D. from the Derner Institute of Advanced Psychological Studies at Adelphi University and has taught graduate courses in trauma, psychopathology, and developmental psychology. She's also a hero of ours. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Allison Gill. In addition to being a veteran, Ph.D., and a federal government executive, Allison is a comedian, author, and staunch advocate for the resistance. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Reckoning from Books and Books below. We truly appreciate every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Hi, Allison.
Hi, hello, Mary. It's wonderful to see you. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. And again, a big thank you to Books and Books in Miami, and in partnership, of course, with the Miami Book Fair. We really appreciate this platform and the ability to speak to all of you tonight and take your questions. Mary, is there anything you want to say before we begin our conversation about The Reckoning?
Just also to express my gratitude to Books and Books and the Miami Book Fair. As I said earlier, Books and Books is one of my favorite bookstores, and I miss it. Haven't been to Florida in a while for perhaps obvious reasons. And I'm so grateful to everybody who's here tonight. I hope that we can answer your questions and make this interesting. And I just wish we could do it in person, but hopefully next time that will be an option. And let's get going.
All right. Well, I would like to jump right in, if it's okay with you, and discuss the introduction and early chapters of the book, because I think one of the most important things you talk about is sort of the trauma we face as a society just since our inception as a country, not just from recent events, and how that ongoing unchecked trauma has led us to where we are now. And then, of course, how we can heal and move forward from that. And you begin the book, there's a lot in here that has to be discussed and confronted. But I think the thing that stood out to me the most in the early chapters was the failure of Reconstruction and how it was kind of set up to fail, doomed to fail by some of the amendments to the Constitution and what was already woven into our fabric as a society from the Calvinistic point of view of the early Puritans, et cetera. Can we talk a little bit about Reconstruction and how that first great failure, I mean, there are many, but how that sort of kicked it off into this I guess the only way I can characterize it is a wound that has never healed.
Yeah. The thing about Reconstruction that is in some ways so heartbreaking is that the potential for change was extraordinary, and so were the accomplishments. In a 12-year period, Congress was able to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which was no small feat. The problem, and by the way, that was that freed African Americans from their bonds of enslavement, that gave Black men the vote, and it provided certain protections against government encroachment, et cetera. So there was a lot of good there, but because Republicans, who at the time were the pro abolition of slavery party and mostly Northerners, were divided among themselves. On the one hand, yes, they absolutely thought that slavery was an abomination. On the other hand, though, many Northerners were skeptical. Northern Republicans were skeptical that African Americans were indeed equal and did not necessarily want to cede power to them. So that was a huge problem. Another huge problem was because Andrew Johnson was president initially during Reconstruction, and his sympathies lay with the Confederacy. The Confederate states, the traitors to America, were not sufficiently punished, and one could say they weren't punished at all, actually. So the potential for real change, the potential for creating a real biracial democracy was almost dead on arrival because of those competing interests. That set up Jim Crow, the century of Jim Crow. Because as Brian Stevenson from the Equal Justice Initiative has said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the North won the war, but the South won the narrative. And we continue to struggle with this as we see white supremacists, the Proud Boys, the KKK, the Three Percenters, et cetera, co-opting the language of the lost cause, which is one, that the Civil War was not fought over slavery. It was a states' rights issue, and the South was really operating in good faith. And the Southern culture, the pre-Civil War South, was this honorable society that was really just doing what it thought was right. And none of that, of course, is true. But that myth continues to be operative in very powerful ways today. What we also can't forget is that it's not as if slavery ended in 1865 and everybody was better. We were dealing with 8 generations of the most horrific trauma perpetuated against a significant portion of our population. And that trauma just doesn't go away. So it gets compounded over time. And I would argue that we're still dealing with it because we never have dealt with it appropriately.
Yeah, and you draw parallels between personal trauma and societal trauma in that way, at which I think, first of all, you're, well poised to do with with your pedigree, but it really kind of made me think a lot about the parallels between individual trauma and national trauma. And I remember you saying, in the book, that trauma doesn't necessarily have to be about one single event. It can be about long, drawn out, perpetual, slow events. And I think that comparison, or that distinction, I should say, is very important to understand the later chapters in the book when we talk about how to move forward.
Yeah, it is a really important distinction to make. Another really important thing to say is that once traumatized, a person becomes more susceptible to later trauma because the ground has been softened in a way. So whether we're talking about societal trauma or individual trauma, if the original trauma isn't dealt with, and in this country's case, that's the twin trauma of the genocide of the Native American population and the genocide and enslavement of the African population that was stolen from its homeland, that each subsequent generation starts at a disadvantage. So again, even though the enslaved peoples were freed to some extent, and as you know, that didn't last very long because that 100 years of Jim Crow, the American South was essentially a closed fascist state in which Black Americans had no rights, including the right to vote. But the same is true with individuals. And I think when it does unfold over time, either the trauma is repeated or the same trauma occurs over a period of time, it gets compounded and it becomes what we call complex PTSD. And again, if you don't face the original trauma, and by face, I mean be honest about, allow yourself to feel and acknowledge the feelings attached to that trauma, then there is no healing from it. So both as individuals and as a country, we need to tell that story, and we need to be completely honest about why we are at this quite, in my view, tragic and fraught period in our history.
Yeah, and talking about epigenetics, that trauma can be implanted in our DNA and can last, studies show, 7 generations in some cases. And you brought up something about the freeing of the slaves, and said to some extent. And I wanted to dig a little bit deeper in that, because in the book you go into all of the other ways that Black Americans are prohibited from entering white society over the centuries, including we start obviously with slavery, but then sharecropping. And then you talk about the GI Bill and unions. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that, because it never stopped.
It never stopped, and it still hasn't stopped. And, again, as you said, the trauma gets passed down because one of the mechanisms through which white Americans were able to convince themselves that enslaving other human beings was an okay thing to do is that they dehumanized. Well, first of all, they created race. And of course, the default race became the white race, which was, of course, superior to all other races. They dehumanized Black people, and also made it their goal, one, to strip them of their native languages and religions, to strip them from their families, and to deny them literacy and community. So by the time Reconstruction rolled around, Black Americans were in a very vulnerable place. And because of certain language in the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, there weren't enough protections in place to keep those rights safe. So we ended up in a situation where it became very easy, again, partially because the Southern Confederacy states weren't really held accountable for anything. But also because the loopholes, particularly in the 13th Amendment at that time, made it possible for the states to change their constitutions to deny Black Americans the franchise. And it was just sort of a downhill from there. And with impunity, they put in place what they called Black Codes, which were laws that led to a Jim Crow type situation post 1877. And after Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court held that separate and equal were just fine, then there was really no going back from that until after 100 years of lynchings and 100 years of torture and 100 years of denying the most basic human rights to Black Americans, even though, of course, they were allowed to fight our wars, right? It took the civil disobedience and civil unrest of the 50s and 60s to get us to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65. Before things changed in a significant way.
Yeah, and you also brought up a minute ago kind of the purpose of accountability, and it reminded me of in the book when you discuss Thomas Jefferson, and you say the need for and purpose of accountability are often obscured by revisionist history that hides or completely elides the fact that might otherwise help us revise our assessments of people like Robert E. Lee and Thomas Jefferson. Only by clear, factual reckoning of history can we make more informed decisions about who we hold up as an example. And I think that the parallels that you draw between, that kind of racialization and pseudoscience that was required for whites to justify what they had done and continued to do, I think that you bring that forward into, you draw that thread between that through the centuries up to and including 2017 with the Muslim ban, and then what you had, I believe you called the most egregious, or the peak of Donald's cruelty, the family separation policy. And when you talked about dehumanization, I instantly went to the created border crises and the rhetoric surrounding that horrible part of our recent history, including the dehumanization, the comments about vermin and the comments about disease. And it kind of began when he came down the golden escalator.
Yeah, well, it maybe culminated with that because, again, and I just realized I forgot to answer your question before about the GI Bill and unions, because either people forget, I'm sure a lot of people know this and don't ever forget, including most Black Americans, or we've never been taught, because white Americans have the privilege of not having to remember this stuff, right? It's never or often not made to resonate in our own lives, which of course it should. But even as things may be improved in some quarters throughout the 20th century, at every opportunity when things were made available to citizens, either who had served or to improve workers' lives, Black Americans were shut out. So what we don't think about this or what a lot of white Americans don't think about this situation in terms of wealth, right? So white Americans, white GIs, were able to get like zero interest housing mortgages for their houses, right? They were able to create middle-class lives, create wealth. They had free college educations, and that wealth got passed down. Black Americans got completely excluded from that. The same thing happened with unions. So white Americans had access to unions, which improved their working conditions, which gave them collective bargaining, which increased their ability to earn a decent wage. Black Americans were cut out of that. So it's not just, it infuriates me when people say, slavery was 150 years ago. I didn't own slaves. It's not my fault. Now, okay, first of all, it's not anybody's fault who's alive today that there was slavery for 400 years in this country. However, if we benefit from that, even though we don't intend to or didn't even want to, we need to take responsibility for that and realize, and part of that is realizing that at every generation to the current day, Black Americans continue to have wealth and opportunity stolen from them. It's that simple, and we need to see it in those terms. So I just wanted to go back to that point because I think it is really important. And we also see how eliding these very significant points in our history by telling us a story about America's greatness. And America's quite good at this. We tell ourselves myths about ourselves that we totally buy into, but that are completely at odds with the reality. One of the most egregious, in my view, is that during World War II, we led the Allies, thank goodness, fighting fascism, the beacon of democracy throughout the world. That needed to happen. But at the same time, as I said earlier, the American South was a closed fascist state that had been committing the same kinds of atrocities against Black Americans for hundreds of years that Nazi Germany had been inflicting for 20. So we can't ever forget that. And we need to unpack those myths so we can get at the truth. Unfortunately, they become so entrenched and people get so identified with this myth of white supremacy and white privilege that it feels like a personal attack when you challenge them on it, right? And I think that's why somebody like Donald, who a journalist said to me recently, is a man 250 years in the making. He's like the reductio ad absurdum of American history and our failures of accountability and our need to keep people ignorant and uneducated about our history, because what he was selling really did resonate with a lot of people. I tried for a really long time to figure out, okay, what are they seeing in him that I don't see? And I realized they're not seeing anything in him I don't see. They admire the things that I revile. And that's partially why we are where we are, and partially why 12 million more people voted for him in 2020 than did in 2016.
Yeah, and that so many people are missing a lot of this. For example, myself included, I remember when Donald was going to hold a rally in Tulsa, and it had been pointed out on the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, and immediately millions of white people started Googling what is the Tulsa massacre, because they didn't teach us that or any of that in school. And I had even put out a tweet, Mary Cawley, hey, tell me when you learned about this. And most people said I was today years old, so to speak. And it's
the same thing with Juneteenth and all sorts of other incredibly important markers in American history. Because again, white Americans have the luxury of thinking that Black American history is not our history, which is, of course, absurd, because this country was built on the backs and with the blood of Black Americans. This country would be a poor backwater if it were not for the stolen lives and labor of Black Americans.
Yeah, and that continued even after it was supposed to stop.
Yes, indeed.
And another really important point, and by the way, that's why I think that this book is so important for everybody to read, is so that we get a sense of that history, and hopefully that leads people to look further into history and kind of study and come to terms with it, at minimum, understand what's happened in the past. And there was this great point in the book where you say, a lot of people say with great power comes great responsibility. That's not how it works here. It's with great power comes a lot less responsibility, and you get off the hook a lot of the times. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about our long history of people getting off the hook and not being held accountable, and how that ties into Donald, because a lot of that you went into in your first book, Too Much and Never Enough. But, as it says, it kind of culminates here in The Reckoning. So, we can go back as far as, recent as Obama and Jimmy Carter, but as far back as, Robert E. Lee having a school named after him and getting land back, et cetera. So can maybe talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think Robert E. Lee is the paradigm and the most egregious example of this, right? He led the army, the traitorous army, against his own country. Before that and during that, he owned and tortured other human beings, and he was directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans, which might sound like somebody we all know. So again, not only did he not, I think he had his right to vote taken away from him. But as you mentioned, he became the president of Washington University, had a quite lovely life. And after he died, the university was renamed for him. It is, I believe, now still Washington and Lee University. And in one of the most breathtakingly cynical acts I can think of, in 1973 or 4, President Gerald Ford pardoned Robert E. Lee and reinstated his right to the franchise. I guess it was a little too late for that, but still. And for whom did he do that? And for what purpose? And think about the harm that did to people who understood what it meant. And just to be fair, Jimmy Carter, in an equally cynical, but I'm guessing for different ways, move, pardoned Jefferson Davis. Sorry, Davis. I always say Sessions, and it's clearly not Jefferson Sessions who was pardoned for being president of the Confederacy, although he could have been, is my guess.
And he plays one on TV.
Yes, exactly. And in real life, probably. So Jimmy Carter most likely did it to appeal to, the elusive right wing that the Democrats seem always to be chasing. So if you can't hold people like that accountable, is it a surprise that we end up with somebody like Donald Trump, who's never been held accountable for anything in his entire life? And then, and in between, Nixon, not just because of Watergate, which was nothing compared to what we're going through right now, but because he, as far as we can tell from recently released documents, he stole the election in 1968. And Barack Obama, and Eric Holder, who let the big banks, who almost bankrupt the entire world and seriously damaged the lives financially of hundreds of millions of tens of millions of Americans. And the banks disappeared trillions of dollars of wealth, and not one of those people was held accountable. Plus the fact that, Barack Obama also was not able to see his way clear to holding people accountable who thought that torture was a perfectly fine activity to engage in. So, we see examples of this everywhere. Obviously, some are much worse than others. But given that, it's really not surprising. If your attitude always is, we can't look back, we have to look forward, you are never going to get out of this very serious closed loop of impunity and inflicted trauma. And the same is true for individuals, as is true for our country right now.
Well, Mary, whenever I talk to my therapist and I try to bring something up from my childhood, my therapist always reminds me, no, we need to look forward. And I'm just kidding.
I was going to say, we need to have a little conversation about that.
No, I'm being satirical to illustrate the ridiculousness of the claim that we don't need to look back. Something interesting you brought up too with Nixon in the book is the Logan Act violation. It just went totally unchecked, and you could talk a little bit about that. But it just immediately took me to General Flynn, who, before they took office, made phone calls to the Russians and said, "Chill, it's gonna be cool." Yep. And violated the Logan Act. And everybody in the media was like, oh, they never prosecute the Logan Act. It's not even a thing. They'll just get him for lying. He ended up being pardoned, walked free, no accountability. But why do we never prosecute the Logan Act?
Or the Hatch Act, for that matter, which is less serious, but still, like, what's it there for? It's sort of like the foot fault rule in tennis. When line judges or foot fault judges call it, people get mad at them. I'm like, well, it's a rule for a reason, guys, because it isn't fair. So I don't know. And that's one of the things I think we learned in a way that we never had to before, is that our institutions are inherently weak. It is so easy to take advantage of them. It is so easy to dismantle them. Think about the damage that was done over that 4-year period between 2017 and 2021 to the Department of Justice, to the State Department. I mean, we're talking about generational damage to the State Department and to American diplomacy because of the mass resignations, the mass firings, the installation of cronies and sycophants. So, I mean, I sort of feel like if Donald taught us nothing else, it's that.
Yeah, and something that also really stood out to me was, and I'm quoting, you noted that it wasn't just Donald himself, but you say that he appointed people who aren't as incompetent as he is, that built a lean and ruthless machine for advancing fascism. And as soon as I read that line, I'm thinking of what we're facing this week, finding out and uncovering the 6-part memo on how to do a coup, and the from John Eastman, or the Clark letter that was going to be sent to 7 states to get him to appoint an alternate slate of electors, and how close we were, but how well-oiled that fascist machine was. It was just steps away from being put into motion.
Right. And one of the problems is relating to what I just said about inherent institutional weaknesses, is what's the good of congressional subpoenas? They're not enforced. How do you enforce them anyway? So time after time, the criminals, the transgressors get away with it because there is not a strong enough mechanism in place to force them to comply. We saw that during both impeachment trials. I'm not going to testify. What's interesting to me is, like, you can't do that in a court of law without being found in contempt and thrown into jail. So the fact that the United States Congress has less power is quite something, right? And who wouldn't defy it? And that's one of the most troubling things is, yes, Donald knows nothing about the United States government and how it works. He cares nothing about America, the American experiment, or the American people. However, he has plenty of people working within the system who know much more, who know how to work the levers of power, who will do the work for him. And we need to be very vigilant about that.
Yeah, and that's sort of, chapter 7 is called The Precipice, and I feel two of them, right? I feel the precipice of, we are now on the verge of waiting to see if yet again we fail to hold people accountable. We've already kind of crossed that bridge with folks like Manafort and Flynn, et cetera, with the first investigation from the Mueller investigation, but now we're waiting to see if not just the January 6th Select Committee, but the Department of Justice will criminally look into what the Senate came out with today, that this was a conspiracy to overthrow the government, and they came this close because of the people Donald put in charge, that he was allowed to put in charge because of the hundreds of years of history that we have that allowed him to do it.
Right.
But also on the precipice of, you say in the book, we have this unique opportunity now to rebuild and make things the way that they ought to have been the entire time. And we need to not squander that, much like, we need to not have mealy-mouthed rules and to put into place that can backslide right back into where we were before. And I think that also, that precipice, so to speak, is kind of also these are just huge challenges we're facing.
Yeah, we need to be really clear about this. The Democrats didn't win an election simply. We snatched democracy from the jaws of autocracy, which doesn't happen often. And unfortunately, that didn't mean that our troubles were at an end, because the Republican Party, which could easily have taken that final off-ramp away from Donald and let him just slide into oblivion and irrelevance, decided to keep him relevant and keep him powerful. So unfortunately, President Biden, in my view, was completely wrong when he said during his inauguration speech that democracy prevailed. It did not prevail. We hung on to it. It held on to it, but yeah. But whether or not we will remains an open question. And it still has a gun pointed at its head. And that gun is, the bullet in that gun is fascism, which this country is quite familiar with. It's not like this is new. The blueprint is there, and lots of people, especially the seditionists who continue to be in our Senate and in our House of Representatives, they're very familiar with that blueprint, and they're more than willing to follow it. And what's stopping them? Because again, they're still running our government. So the Democrats need to understand what's at stake and act like they have the majority, which they do. I don't care how slim it is, and play hardball.
Yeah, and in that sense, the insurrection, just the act itself, was sort of a metaphor for how we barely held democracy. Because I think of the officers that testified to the Select Committee, and how they, barely held the line that day, barely prevented insurrectionists from getting a hold, getting their hands on members of Congress or their hands on the certification paperwork documents, the certificate, the literal certificates. I feel like, metaphorically speaking, this country was that line of defense that day, and it was breached, but it held. But it's not like all of a sudden the Capitol Police are like, everything's great, take down everything, we're good, everyone's mentally fine, look forward. There's a lot that has to be reckoned with, if you will.
If you will. Yeah, there does indeed have to be a reckoning. But think about it. How many times in the last 5 years did we say, okay, this held, this held, this held? First of all, a lot of things did not hold, but enough did to get us to this point. The other very worrisome thing, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to bring everybody down, but I have to be completely honest. This is not a fun read. We're grappling with a lot of really tough issues, but necessary issues to get us to a better place, hopefully. How much longer are we going to be able to hold? By the time the first 3 years of Donald's administration had gone by and demoralized us, exhausted us, etc., we were already very depleted. And then COVID hits, right? And then I imagine most people probably didn't understand just how bad it was going to get, because I literally can't think of a worse person on the planet to have been in charge during that particular kind of crisis. So we're in our fourth wave of COVID, or we're coming off of our fourth wave of COVID. It's been so divisive. And I find, of all of the diabolical things Donald has done, and as you've mentioned, there are many, one of the most diabolical is the way in which he divided us over COVID at a time when we most needed to be united, and how many tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost because of that division, right? So it's very difficult to face the fact that it isn't over and we can't let our guard down. Because again, I think a lot of people also felt, oh, okay, Biden, he didn't just win, he won by 7 million votes, almost 8 million votes. And Democrats held the House, although not as well as they should have. Democrats got the Senate back, although it was not as big a margin as they should have. Everything's going to be just fine. We can breathe. Well, no, we can't. And I worry about that too, because it is a lot to ask of people. It is a lot to ask people to admit over and over and over again that we're not safe yet, and that you think 2020 was the most important election of your lifetime. Well, guess what? 2022 is the most important election of your lifetime now. And if the Democrats hold in 2022, then guess what? 2024 will be the most important election. So yeah, I mean, I feel it too. But I do worry about it as well, because we've all been very traumatized over the last year and a half, if not 4.5 years.
Yeah, it's so difficult to continue to have the most important election of your lifetime every 2 years when you are so tired. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like you can't take a win. But I think what's important, Biden won by 7 million, 8 million votes, but you bring up the point, 74 million people voted for Donald. And you talk about the base. And you say, on one end, we have actual Christo-fascists, mm-hmm. And unreconstructed white supremacists, like, as you mentioned, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers. On the other end is low-info, knee-jerk voters. And in between are the I've got mine Republicans, who are made uncomfortable by diversity. And this division sowed by the politicization of COVID reminds me of, I know we're supposed to be talking about the reckoning, but it reminds me of something from Too Much and Never Enough, where you say he is incapable of being a hero, because being a hero means you have to acknowledge there's a problem, and he's not about to do that. And so I don't know if he fell forward into dividing us, or if it were, do you know what I mean? Or if it was intentional, or if he's just incapable of being a hero? Because you do say here he doesn't have the ability to be a leader.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's clear. But in terms of, think of it this way. Any person with the slightest bit of political savvy, or it didn't even require empathy. It just required some modicum of intelligence, even if you were a sociopath. You would have realized that your best way forward was to unite everybody vis-a-vis COVID. And because one thing I talk about is there are a lot of people in any culture that have authoritarian personality. And those are the people who they need a leader to follow. They don't like change. They like the status quo. And in an us versus them situation, they always want to be the us. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're on the right or that they're reactionary. It just means you need to define the terms properly. And if we had defined the terms as us versus COVID, they would have been completely on board. And Donald probably would have had a 90% approval rating, because there's no way, first of all, nobody, I'm guessing, would have thought that the person in the Oval Office would have been against wearing masks or social distancing. There was, okay, we're going to do everything we can. But no, it became us versus us, Donald supporters versus Democrats versus people in cities versus people of color. So he blew that opportunity because he can't handle unity. He needs division. And, so far it seems to be working out for him, not for us. And that's why I say that, need to hang on to the reality that there are so many more of us than there are of them.
We do. We definitely do. Mary, we have a few questions in our quiver. If you wouldn't mind taking some questions, there's one here from Majub Alem, who says, do you think there's a way to make white Americans change their minds about the myth of white supremacy?
I do. I mean, if I didn't, I don't know that I would have written the book, because that would just be way too depressing. Don't get me wrong. There are plenty of them who can't be convinced, or who won't be allowed access to the kind of education that would help convince them. Because let's not forget, a majority of white Americans has never voted for the Democratic cause. It's always been a coalition of, a minority of white Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that is possible. And the way to do that is to help people understand, first of all, have empathy, right? Help people understand just what has happened. Like, if you really do understand our history, you cannot, you shouldn't be comfortable with the benefits that have accrued to you as a white American, whether you want them or not. White privilege is a travesty. I can't give it up. I can't. It's not up to me.
You can't waive your white privilege.
I need to be mindful of it. And in those instances where I can refuse to take advantage of it, but I can't give it up. Because it's with me wherever I go. I hail a cab, whatever the case may be. So I have an interaction with a cop. I don't have to worry about that. So that's part of it. The other part of it too is to help to, if empathy is not enough, which it should be, but sometimes it isn't, it's really important to help white people understand what they lose by clinging to the idea of white supremacy or clinging to their white privilege. We lose so much in terms of friendships and culture and self-respect, quite honestly. So if we can put it in those terms, then I think we could make some inroads, not with all of them, certainly, but with enough. And that's all it takes, because this is going to be a long-term project. And all we need to do is, in my view, continue to ignore that 25% who are the worst among us, who will always be the worst among us. And again, I think that one of the points of liberal democracy is to contain those people and don't give them any power. They've had all of the power from 2017 to 2019. Let's take away their power, and then work on the people who, again, are afraid of change and like consistency, and the people who are low information voters. And I think also just making people's lives better through legislation and helping show them that government is a force for good in their lives. And in fact, the government is them, right? Will give them an opportunity to have the time to take in these very important messages.
Yeah, that's true. And education too. I mean, I think that's why the fascist wing of the Republican Party, which you mentioned in the book, we shouldn't be afraid to use that language.
And it's not a wing, it's the entire party at this point.
Yes. And you know, I'm like sort of separating out Liz Cheney, but you know, whatever.
Did you vote for the Voting Rights Act?
Yep, no. And that's why I walked right back off that. But that's why they want to whitewash history education in classrooms and have stolen and taken the term critical race theory and turned it into something that it isn't. And that, I mean, why else? Because if we do teach these things, I think it helps. And you know, and so I think they wouldn't be spending billions of dollars to take it out of schools if it didn't help their cause.
Well, first of all, it's not in schools. Critical race theory is a legal theory that's not.
Oh no,
in schools. Oh, you mean like actual history? Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And you know, and in order for history, the teaching of history to sink in, we need to start teaching civics in a way that helps them understand why it's necessary to understand government, or why government is necessary to their day-to-day lives, as opposed to making it one semester in junior and high school. Like, we need to teach it throughout elementary school, middle school, and high school. But we also need to start teaching critical thinking skills and media literacy, because all of those things go together. And I'm sorry, I'm totally off topic, but it's all very important.
It's okay. I left plenty of time for the questions. And next up is from Richard Russell, who wants to know, what role has the Democratic Party played in the trauma of African Americans since the Civil War?
I mean, it's incalculable, and that's the problem. When we engage in revisionist history, what we do is we tend to have a very black and white view, if you'll forgive the expression, of the heroes and the villains. But it isn't that simple. And again, I mean, obviously the Republicans in the Civil War era and Reconstruction are today's Democratic Party. So it's a little confusing, but you know, let's just assume that we're talking about the Democratic Party across the board. As I said earlier, a lot of them didn't buy into the idea that Black Americans were fully human or fully allowed equality. Mm-hmm. It was because of power. And, you know, part of that problem was because the Southern Democrats never lost power and had too much leverage. So they always had to be negotiating with them. And they just didn't do enough to stand up to the forces, the anti-democratic forces that have always been operative in this country from the very beginning. And in that, I would include the Supreme Court, which has been among the most anti-democratic institutions, as we're seeing to our horror recently. So I can't let Democrats off the hook at all. And part of that is because there is so much unacknowledged racism it's very uncomfortable for white Americans to admit that they're racist. But I would argue that the number of white Americans who are not racist is vanishingly small, because it's so ingrained in us from such a young age. It takes so much work that, and we also need to make it really clear to maybe help make it more comfortable for people to come to that conclusion, that there is a very big difference between being racist, which is something that's imposed on us as children, and being a racist, which is consciously embracing your hatred of the other, right? So I think in most recent history, the most egregious thing that the Democrats have done is fail to recognize the threat that the Republicans pose to people of color and minorities, any free-thinking, pro-democratic person in this country, but particularly the most vulnerable among us. And that if they don't do that, if they don't grapple with that, then I'm not entirely sure this is going to end well.
Yeah, and like you said in the book, it's not necessarily evil men, but good men who do nothing. And the Democrats, if we're talking about the questioner, Richard said, since the Civil War, if we're talking about the Democrats back then, we flipped parties a few times.
Right, exactly. So it is very confusing, because up until the Civil Rights Act, the Democrats were in our view, the bad guys. The Southern Democrats were awful, and they became, they shifted over to the Republican Party when the Northern Democrats decided that, hey, Black people do deserve to be treated equally in this country. So people like Strom Thurmond is a perfect example of a Democrat who switched parties because he just couldn't handle the fact that the Democratic Party was becoming less racist.
Yeah, and with this, the idea of when good men do nothing, and you brought it up in the book, when the Northerners, like you said, they sort of ceded to the South's view of African Americans because they were afraid of losing their power to Black people, not just losing their power, but
that's right.
And you brought up, you'll have to refresh my memory because I don't have it in front of me, but there was a cycle. It was cyclical, right? Like violence against Black people, and then Black people protect themselves.
Yep.
And then white people say, look, they're violent. And then you go right back to the beginning again. And all of the white people, in order to get this to work, had to be on the same side, either explicitly or implicitly. And that hasn't gone away.
Right. It has not. Yeah. It's a fear based on, at the beginning it was, okay, and I'm assuming a lot of this was unconscious, but, we have enslaved and tortured this entire group of people. If we free them, of course, they will want to commit violence against us. So we will have to be very vigilant, and we will have to keep them down. And if they protect themselves, then that just confirms our idea about them as being violent and unruly. And we need to double down on our efforts to contain them. It's just the way it's been. It continues to be that way. We've seen it with the police violence against Black people, the impunity with which people like Kyle Rittenhouse get away with their. There aren't words enough to describe how despicable that act of cowardice was in his murder of two completely innocent, unarmed Black Americans. But here we are. Has he just started going, he basically went on vacation after that for a while, apparently.
Yeah. It's despicable. Another question here from Leslie Hood, and this is more recent events, particularly the 2016 election. Leslie says that election was crafted by information gathering entities like Cambridge Analytica, Breitbart. Now that regulation of social media platforms may be enacted, do you think that the dark web social media sites will hold enough power to disinform the next election?
I don't know that they would, but I have to be completely honest with you. I think it's a moot point because Facebook isn't going anywhere. Facebook
Yeah,
will
and we
not
still have the 74 million, people who voted for Donald that is just basically a disinformation army now.
Well, and what did we just find out that something like 50% of the Facebook accounts that were anti-vax or bots.
Uh-huh.
So, and Mark Zuckerberg is a sociopath. So I don't, and again, I'm not sure why Congress doesn't have the wherewithal, or maybe it's just because it's a 50-50 split. I don't know. But I mean, I'm just mystified. Yes, social media, Facebook is a huge problem, but I'm also mystified by the fact that Facebook is allowed to roam free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's just disinformation and propaganda. And there's no comparable entity on the left, one, because people on the left don't like to engage in disinformation and propaganda, but for whatever reason, left-leaning billionaires don't seem to think it's worth their while to invest their money in bolstering progressive media. And I don't get it. I really don't, because if you think CNN is progressive, then there's a bridge that's right down the street, I can tell you.
Yeah, it's hard to build. It's not the bridge, but the media.
The bridge was hard to build too, but it's harder.
Hard for me, right? Yeah, but not bridge experts. 2 quick questions, and then we're going to bring books and books back on. Okay. The first question here is: there's an argument that there's racism against white people. What is a logical way to dispel that absolute BS? This is from Lita, and I pronoun she and her, and I did paraphrase the BS part.
Okay, thank you, Lita. I would never imagine that you would say such a thing. It's a great question, and I appreciate it. I actually was interviewed by a British journalist a couple of months ago who asked me like 17 versions of that question. Well, can't people be racist about what? No, the answer is no. And it's simply because it's not simple, but if you are the race in power and you are dictating the terms and you are benefiting from the disparity in power, then in what universe can a minority create any problems for you? It's institutional, it's societal. It's not just, it's not an individual thing, because there is not parity. So it makes me insane. It's okay if a Black American is mean to a white American, then I don't know, maybe they're being impolite, or maybe they're being aggressive or attacking. I don't know, but it isn't racism, because there's the power differential.
Yeah,
it's so enormous at the institutional and societal level that it's just absurd. And the fact that people continue to make that claim is absolutely maddening. And it suggests the degree to which white Americans fail to learn from our history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's 2 easy ways I explain it, Mary. The first is, as a woman, if I punch my rapist in the throat, does that make me a violent aggressor? Mm-hmm. No. Or sometimes I simply say racial oppressors cannot be racially oppressed.
That's right.
So those are my 2 little logical, if you want to do it in bumper sticker, that's good. That's how I do
I don't really speak bumper sticker particularly well, so that was good, and I'm going to steal that from you.
I'm trying to learn so I can get simple messages out. When I did,
listen, Republicans do it.
I couldn't fit the Mueller report on a bumper sticker, unfortunately. And then this last final question, and we'll bring books and books back on. And this is just a fun, quick one because we have time for it. What is your preferred drink of choice when it's not water?
Oh, where to start? Actually, I'll give you 2, because one is like sort of my go-to, and that's just Kettle One, sparkling water and lime, kind of simple. And my special occasion one would be really good rosé champagne.
Samesies, like a verve. Mm,
Or Perrier-Jouet.
yeah. And that
So
question
I
I
could
should
sound like a total snob at the end of the evening. Sorry.
And that question I should say, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, is from Suis Singh. So thank you for that
Thank
question.
you.
Thanks to everyone for all their questions. And now, aside from thanking Books and Books again so much, I would like to invite them back onto the screen. Hi.
And here we are. Bring on the champagne.
Absolutely.
Thank
It's
you.
on me, guys. It's on me.
Okay, we're gonna
I
hold it
wish.
short.
I
We're gonna
wish
hold
we were
it-
all in the same place. I would have brought a case.
Great. Well, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Allison, for your great moderating. Thank you, everyone who's joined us, who's out there watching. Thank you for supporting independent bookstores. And remember, you can order your copy of The Reckoning by just hitting the button on the bottom of the screen, or you can come by any of our bookstores and we have it there as well. Thank you. And it's not too early, to get this as a gift for the holidays. We're reminding everyone that we're going to have some supply chain, issues to deal with. Start making your list now, your wish list now, and definitely The Reckoning should be on it. So
Yeah, and I just want to say really quickly, I haven't checked in a while, but last time I did check, Tucker Carlson and Mark Levin were at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. So like hashtag get the fascists off the list would be my.
Hashtag get the fascists off the list.
We need to make a concerted effort to drown out those voices of just horror. And,
Absolutely. I don't want to lose hope.
No.
And that
No.
And that happens a lot lately, because
it's hard. It's hard
hopeless.
not to, but that's why we need to remember that this isn't a sprint. It isn't even a marathon. It's a relay race. And we need to know that we're in it together. If we need to tap out, we need to trust that other people are going to keep moving things forward for us while we take a break. And as I said at the very beginning, there are so many more of us than there are of them. And they want us to give up hope.
Mm-hmm.
The things that demoralize us and enervate us, energize them. Let's not give them the satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. They pay a lot of money to get us to give up hope and be exasperated and attack our institutions. And so we always have to be cognizant of that, right?
Well, the indie bookstores are with you.
Yes, and we're with the indie bookstores.
We are too.
All over the U.S. So if there's any way, thank you. And if there's any way we can mobilize, we will. So 2022, here we come. Anyway.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.